was in the garage when it started. Not doing anything heroic, just reorganizing the fishing tackle I'd left in the pile since September. The kind of job you keep putting off until a Sunday afternoon in November forces your hand. The radio was on. Some sports talk show I wasn't really listening to. Snow had been threatening all morning, but hadn't committed yet, and the light through the small garage window had that flat, gray quality that makes everything feel suspended. The phone rang. My son's number. I wiped my hands on a rag and answered. Dad. His voice had that particular tightness I'd only heard a handful of times when his mother passed, when he'd lost his job at the surveying firm back in 2019. Simone wants to talk to you about the wedding. Not we want to talk. Not I want to talk. Not I want to talk. Simone wants to talk. I noticed that. Put her on, I said. There was a shuffling sound, a muffled exchange I couldn't quite make out, and then her voice came through, measured, pleasant. The way someone sounds when they've rehearsed being pleasant. Lorne. She always called me Lorne, never Dad, not even after 2 years of being with my son. I'd thought nothing of it for the longest time. We've been talking, Brendan and I, and we think it might be better if you didn't give a speech at the reception. We want to keep things simple. I stood there in the garage holding a lure I'd been unknotting for 10 minutes. All right, I said. That's fine. And it was fine, I told myself. Some people don't like speeches. Some couples want a clean evening without the sentimental father rambling on for 20 minutes. I put the phone down and went back to the tackle and didn't let myself think about it too hard. But that was March. By April, the invitations had gone out, and I noticed my name wasn't on the seating chart my son had accidentally left open on his laptop when he visited. Not at the head table. Not near the front. I was somewhere toward the back, next to my cousin Wendell and his wife, which wasn't an insult exactly, but it wasn't nothing either. I'm 63 years old. I raised Brendan alone after his mother passed from cancer when he was 14. I coached his hockey teams, drove him to university in Kingston with his mattress tied to the roof of my pickup, co-signed his first apartment lease when no landlord in Ottawa would look twice at a 22-year-old with no credit. I am not a dramatic man. I am not a man who makes scenes or demands gratitude or keeps score. But I do pay attention. And I had been paying attention to Simone for longer than she knew. She came into Brendan's life in the spring of 2022, about 3 years after his divorce from his first wife. A quiet, kind woman named Audra, who'd moved to BC and remarried and, by all accounts, was doing well. Brendan had been lonely after Audra left, not in the way that makes a man fall apart, but in the quieter way, the way where you stop cooking real meals and start watching too much television and answer every "how are you" with "fine, fine" before changing the subject. Simone arrived at a work function, the way people meet in their 30s. She was sharp, well-presented, knew how to enter a room. Brendan called me after their third date, sounding lighter than he had in years. I was glad for him. I met her the following month. We had dinner at a steakhouse in Kanata. Brendan's pick. She was charming, engaged, asked me questions about my career. I'd spent 30 years as a site supervisor for a civil engineering contractor before retiring. She seemed genuinely interested. She laughed at my stories. The ones I knew weren't that funny, and she touched Brendan's hand across the table in a way that looked affectionate, but felt to me like someone demonstrating ownership. I told myself I was being ungenerous. I went home and sat in my kitchen and reminded myself that I was a 61-year-old widower who sometimes confused wariness for wisdom, and that my son deserved happiness, and that I should be glad and stop looking for problems where there weren't any. I was glad. I also kept paying attention. Over the following year, small things accumulated the way small things do. Not any single thing that would make a reasonable person raise an alarm, but a pattern that someone who'd been in construction for 3 decades learns to recognize. Patterns matter. A hairline crack in a foundation wall might mean nothing. Hairline cracks in 6 different places mean you need to stop and look harder. Brendan stopped coming to Sunday dinners in August of that year, not abruptly. He'd come every few weeks, then once a month. Then the invitations started being answered with, "We have plans," without further explanation. He'd always been a man who kept his commitments, who called when he said he'd call. He started forgetting things. Small things. My birthday. The anniversary of his mother's death, which we'd always acknowledged quietly together. When I mentioned the anniversary, he apologized in the way that meant he'd been coached to apologize. Not guilty, just performing guilt. Something Simone had suggested he say. I suspected. The apology arrived by text, which was new. The money question came up in the fall of 2023. Brendan called to tell me they were looking at a house, a semi-detached in Barrhaven, listed at just under $700,000. Good price for the area, he said. They'd been approved for a mortgage. He said it almost in passing, like a weather update, but then came the part that wasn't in passing. We're about $60,000 short for the down payment, he said. We were wondering if you'd consider contributing. As an investment, like you'd be on the deed. I told him I needed to think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I thought about the fact that Simone had a job in pharmaceutical sales that by all appearances paid very well, and that Brendan was managing a team at his firm now and earning more than he ever had. And that $60,000 is not a small number for a man living on a pension and the investments I'd spent 30 years building carefully. I thought about the seating chart, the canceled dinners, the text message apology. I told him I wasn't in a position to contribute to the down payment. The conversation that followed was the first time Brendan had raised his voice at me in 20 years. After he hung up, I sat in the kitchen again and I thought, something is wrong. Not with my son, not at his core, not in the part of him I knew, but something had been built around him, carefully, piece by piece, that was beginning to wall me out. I'm not a man who acts on instinct alone. I'm an engineer's son. My father spent his life looking at problems empirically, and he raised me the same way. So I decided to start looking at this one empirically. I didn't hire anyone. That's not how I do things. What I did was start paying more careful attention to what was already in front of me. I called my friend Hugh, not the Hugh on the list, the other one, Hugh Belanger, who'd retired from the RCMP after 30 years, and now spent his time woodworking and consulting occasionally for insurance firms. We'd fished together for 15 years. I told him what I'd observed. He listened without interrupting, which is a skill most people don't have. You're not paranoid, he said when I finished. But you don't have anything concrete either. I know. If this woman is what you think she might be, he said carefully, she'll have left traces. People like that always do. They can't help it. He wasn't wrong. I started with what was publicly available. Simone had mentioned when we'd first met that she'd come from Calgary originally. She'd spoken about an ex-husband in passing. Briefly, the way you mention something you want acknowledged but not discussed. I knew her last name and her approximate age and the company she worked for, which was listed on LinkedIn. I found a court record from Alberta, 2019. A dissolution of marriage. The ex-husband's name was attached to it. I found him eventually through some patience and a mutual connection on a professional network. A man who'd moved to Edmonton and was now working in logistics. I sent a carefully worded message, not accusatory, just identifying myself as someone with a connection to his ex-wife, who had some concerns. He called me 3 days later. He talked for 45 minutes. I listened to almost all of it. He described a marriage that had begun warmly and shifted, gradually, into something that felt like a business arrangement he hadn't agreed to. Financial decisions made without him, an attempt, toward the end of the marriage, to get him to include her in his company's pension beneficiary designation. When he'd refused, the marriage had deteriorated quickly. Lawyers, an expensive settlement, then silence. She's charming, he said. Really, genuinely charming. And then, one day you realize the charm is the product, and you're the customer. I thanked him and sat with that for a long time. I didn't go to Brendan. Not yet. I knew my son, and if I came to him with a phone call from an ex-husband in Edmonton, he'd hear it as an attack. Simone had spent 2 years carefully repositioning herself in his mind as the primary relationship, and me as the secondary one. The difficult parent. The one who hadn't warmed to her, who'd turned down the loan, who couldn't let his son live his own life. If I walked in too early with too little, she'd use it against me, and I'd lose whatever credibility I had left. I needed something he couldn't dismiss. The opportunity came unexpectedly, the way they sometimes do. In January, Brendan asked me to help him move some furniture. Simone's old couch going out, a new one being delivered. She was away that weekend, visiting a friend in Toronto, she'd said. Brendan and I worked through the afternoon, and for a few hours it was like it used to be the two of us, some physical work, a problem to solve together. We ordered pizza. We sat on the floor of his living room because the new couch hadn't arrived yet, and ate and talked about hockey and the spring fishing season and nothing important. Near the end of the evening, his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it and something crossed his face. Not quite alarmed, but close. He picked it up and moved into the hallway. I wasn't trying to hear, but the apartment was quiet and he hadn't closed the door properly, and his voice, after a moment, carried. I know, I'll figure it out. I said I would. A pause. No, he's leaving soon. Another pause. Because he doesn't know anything yet. Stop. He came back in looking composed and changed the subject without explaining. I didn't ask. On the drive home, I thought about those words. He doesn't know anything yet. Not he doesn't know. Yet. 2 weeks before the wedding, I was at the Shoppers on Merivale when I saw Simone's car in the parking lot of the hotel across the street, the one on the service road. The mid-range chain hotel that didn't fit any errand she'd have been running on a Tuesday afternoon. I noticed it, the way you notice things when you've been paying attention, reflexively, without planning to. I didn't follow her inside. I'm not that man. But I sat in my car for a moment, and then I thought about what Hugh had said. People like that always leave traces. I drove home and I called Hugh. There's a hotel, I said, and a Tuesday afternoon. He was quiet for a moment. Ontario is one-party consent for recording, he said, meaning you can record a conversation you're part of without the other person's knowledge. I'm not going to be in this conversation. No, he said, but you know someone who could be. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to overstate what happened or make it sound more cinematic than it was. What I did was ask a question. I asked Brendan, the following weekend, if he could meet me for lunch. Just the two of us, a Saturday. A diner on Richmond Road that we'd been going to since he was a teenager. He came. We ate. And partway through the meal, I told him I was worried, not about Simone specifically. I was careful about that. I told him I was worried about how far things had drifted between us, that I missed him, that I wanted to understand what had changed. He was defensive at first. Then something loosened. By the end of the meal, he was talking, really talking, in a way he hadn't in over a year. He admitted he'd been feeling stretched thin, that there was pressure he wasn't sure how to describe, that the wedding planning had become something he didn't entirely recognize. I asked him gently what he meant by that. He mentioned that Simone had been very focused on the guest list, on certain names being there, on certain names not being there. He said she'd suggested more than once, in various ways, that the wedding would go more smoothly if I had a minimal role. I asked him how he'd felt about that. He looked at his coffee cup for a long time. I don't know, Dad. I really don't know anymore. We didn't solve anything that day. But I'd planted something, and I knew it. And he'd said, before we left, that he'd think about some things. That he'd call me. He didn't call before the wedding. But he didn't need to. The wedding was on a Saturday in late April at a venue in the Gatineau Hills, a converted farmhouse with a view of the Ottawa River that I'll admit was beautiful. I dressed carefully. I was polite to everyone I greeted. I sat where I'd been seated, near the back, next to my cousin Wendell and his wife Patrice, and I watched the ceremony from a distance that felt symbolic in a way I tried not to dwell on. Simone looked striking in her dress. She had a way of filling a room, of making herself the gravitational center of any space. I watched her scanning the crowd during the cocktail hour, not looking for her guests, I noticed, but cataloging them, making sure the arrangement was what she'd arranged. Our eyes met once. Briefly, she smiled at me. The kind of smile that meant nothing. It was during the dinner, before the speeches, which I was not giving, that she came to my table. Wendell had stepped away, and Patrice was talking to someone across the aisle, and Simone stood beside my chair and said quietly, pleasantly, looking out at the room rather than at me, "I want you to enjoy this evening, Lauren, but I also want you to know that this is Brendan's and my life now, and if you're going to continue being a part of it, some things will have to change." I looked at her. I said, "What kinds of things?" "The doubt," she said. "The questions. Whatever you've been doing, it creates a distance between him and me, and I won't have it. Tonight, especially, I need you to be invisible." She said it warmly, pleasantly, still looking at the room. "If you want to step outside and get some air, that would be lovely. Really, Lauren, it's a beautiful night." I set my napkin on the table. I stood up. I said, "That's a reasonable suggestion, but I'm going to take someone with me." She finally looked at me then. Her expression shifted, not much, but enough. I walked to the head table and I crouched beside my son's chair, and I said 3 sentences into his ear. I told him I loved him. I told him I had something that belonged to him, information that was his to have. And I told him that when he was ready to hear it, I'd be waiting outside. Then I walked out. I sat on a low stone wall near the parking lot and looked at the river and the early April darkness and the lights from Gatineau reflecting off the water, and I waited. I didn't know if he'd come. I'd done what I could do. The rest was his. He came out 11 minutes later. I know because I was looking at my watch. He came out still in his jacket and his bow tie, and he sat down next to me on the wall and he said, "Tell me." So I told him. All of it. The Edmonton call. The hotel. The Tuesday afternoon. The things I'd observed, in sequence, with the same methodical attention I'd give to a structural problem on a job site. I told him about the phone call I'd overheard. The conversation about the loan. The way the world around him had been slowly rearranged. I did not editorialize. I did not tell him what to feel. I laid it out and I let it sit between us. He was quiet for a long time. "The ex-husband," he said finally. "He told you all of this?" "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." "I didn't have enough yet, and I knew what would happen if I came to you too early." He was quiet again. The door to the venue opened and closed behind us, someone stepping out for a cigarette, giving us a wide berth when they saw 2 men sitting in silence. "She asked me to put her name on my RRSP beneficiary designation last month," Brendan said. "I didn't do it, but she asked. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was normal." He pulled at a thread on his jacket. She has a way of making everything seem normal. We talked for an hour. The reception continued without us. At some point, someone came to find him. I think it was one of his groomsmen, and he sent them back inside. At another point, his phone lit up with her name several times, and he set it face down on the wall beside him. Near the end of the hour, he asked me, "What do I do now?" "That's yours to decide," I said. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I know. The rest is your life." He nodded. He sat there a little longer. Then he said something I won't forget. "I think I've known for a few months. I think I just needed someone to say it out loud who wasn't afraid to say it." I put my hand on his shoulder. We stayed on that wall until it got cold, which in late April in the Ottawa Valley doesn't take long. I'll spare the details of what came next because they belong to Brendan, not to me. What I'll say is this. The evening did not end the way she'd planned it. There were conversations I was not part of. A lawyer was contacted the following week. Brendan's lawyer, not one she'd suggested. Documents were reviewed. The marriage, which had legally taken place in the ceremony I'd sat at the back for, was beginning an annulment process within a month, on grounds that Brendan's legal counsel felt were solid. She did not take it without a fight, but she also didn't have much to fight with, because Brendan had made sure, in the weeks between my lunch and the wedding, to do some of his own looking. He found things I hadn't. He confirmed things he'd half noticed and pushed aside. The house in Barhaven was still in his name alone. The RRSP designation still had me on it, which I only found out later, which undid me quietly in a way I'm still not entirely sure how to describe. The first Sunday dinner Brendan showed up for again, about 6 weeks after the wedding. He arrived with a grocery bag, steaks, potatoes, something green for show, and he stood in my kitchen and he looked about 5 years younger than he had in 12 months. And, he said, I should have called more. Yes, I said. You should have. We ate. The hockey game was on. We didn't talk about any of it, not directly. There wasn't anything left to say that hadn't been said on a stone wall in the dark beside the Ottawa River. He comes for dinner most Sundays now. He's seeing someone he met through a colleague. Slowly, carefully, the way someone who's been burned learns to do things. She came to dinner 3 weeks ago, a woman called Petra who works in environmental consulting and who laughed, genuinely laughed, at a story that actually wasn't that funny and didn't touch his hand in a way that felt like demonstration. I noticed that too. I'm 63 years old, and I know that paying attention is not the same as being suspicious, and that loving someone is not the same as protecting them from everything, and that there is a version of fatherhood that has to be earned back after it's been quietly undermined. I earned it back on a cold stone wall in April. I'd do it again without hesitating. I've been thinking about what it actually takes to hold on to someone you love without holding them back. It's not a clean thing. There's no instruction for it. When I look back at everything that happened between me and Brendan, what strikes me most isn't the wedding, or the stone wall, or even the conversation with the ex-husband in Edmonton. What strikes me is how long I sat on what I knew and said nothing. Not because I was afraid, exactly. Because I understood that getting it wrong, going too early, too hard, too emotional, would cost me my son permanently, and I wasn't willing to pay that price. That's not instinct. That's discipline. And discipline, I've come to believe, is the thing that separates people who mean well from people who actually do well. Simone was intelligent. I want to be honest about that, because it matters. She wasn't some obvious villain. She was patient, calibrated, and she understood people, how they want to be seen, where their soft spots are, how to make a man feel chosen while quietly rewriting what he's choosing. She'd done it before. She would have done it again. The harm she was capable of wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, and gradual harm is the kind that's hardest to name until it's already settled in. What I did, the calls, the listening, the waiting, wasn't revenge. I don't have any interest in revenge. What I wanted was accurate information, delivered at the right moment, to the one person who needed it most. That's it. Everything else followed from that. There's something people don't say enough about the relationship between a parent and an adult child. It has to be re-earned. Constantly. Not through sacrifice or guilt or money. Those are poor substitutes. But through showing up as someone worth listening to. I had to be the kind of father whose word meant something when it mattered most. That meant years of being steady and honest even when it cost me, including the dinner where Brendan raised his voice at me over the loan. I didn't fight back that night. I let it sit because I knew there would come a moment when he'd need to trust me completely, and I couldn't afford to have debt on that account. The morning after the wedding, I drove home through the Gatineau Hills, and the river was still there, flat and gray in the early light, and I felt something I can only describe as quiet. Not victory. Not even relief, exactly. Just quiet. The kind that comes when you've done what you set out to do without flinching, without shortcuts, without becoming something you wouldn't recognize. Brendan is rebuilding now. Carefully, slowly. The way someone who's been burned learns to do things, as I said before. I watch him and I see, more clearly than I have in years, the man his mother and I raised. He's in there. He was always in there. He just needed someone who refused to stop looking for him. That, I think, is what I'd want anyone to take from this. Not that parents are always right, because we're not. Not that love always wins, because the world isn't that tidy. But that paying attention is an act of love. That patience is not passivity. That knowing when to speak and when to wait and how to say the hard thing without destroying the person you're saying it to. That is a skill, and it is learnable, and it is worth every difficult, unglamorous hour it takes to develop it. I'm 63. I still have things to figure out, but I know this much. The most important thing I ever built wasn't a road or a bridge or a drainage system for a southeast corner of some field in eastern Ontario. It was the trust of one person who needed it on a cold night in April. That one I'll take.